The grand corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace echoed with whispered conversations that autumn morning. Queen Isabella moved gracefully through the marble hallways, her silk gown rustling against the polished floors. To any observer, she appeared to be the perfect royal consort, elegant and composed. But behind her carefully crafted smile lay a mind sharp as steel and twice as dangerous. King Edward sat in his private study, surrounded by towering bookshelves and ancient portraits of his ancestors. At 68, he had ruled the Kingdom of Aldermere for over 2 decades, but lately, something had changed. The once confident monarch now seemed hesitant, often glancing toward his wife before making decisions that once came naturally to him. "My dear," Isabella said as she entered the study without knocking, "I've been thinking about the upcoming trade negotiations with the Northern Territories." Edward looked up from the documents scattered across his mahogany desk. "Oh, what about them?" Isabella settled into the chair across from him, her movements calculated and precise. "Perhaps it would be wise to postpone them. The timing seems unfortunate." "Postpone?" Edward frowned. "But these negotiations have been planned for months. Our economic advisors say they're crucial for the kingdom's future prosperity." "Economic advisors can be wrong, darling." Isabella's voice carried a subtle edge that Edward had learned to recognize over the years. Sometimes, a woman's intuition is worth more than all their charts and numbers. This conversation had become all too familiar in recent months. What had started as gentle suggestions from Isabella had gradually transformed into firm directives. Edward found himself questioning decisions he had once made with confidence, second-guessing his own judgment in favor of his wife's increasingly forceful opinions. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander was dealing with his own frustrations in the palace's East Wing. At 35, he had been groomed his entire life to eventually take the throne. But lately, he felt like he was watching his father slip away from the man he had once admired. "Your Highness," came a voice from the doorway. Alexander turned to see Lord Chamberlain Blackwood, one of his father's oldest advisors, looking troubled. "Lord Blackwood, what brings you here?" The elderly man glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "I wanted to speak with you about certain concerns regarding the recent changes in His Majesty's decision-making process." Alexander gestured for him to sit. He had noticed the changes too, though he hadn't been sure if others had observed them as well. "The king seems to be consulting different sources than he used to," Blackwood said carefully. "Important matters of state that would normally go through the proper channels are now being decided in private conversations." "You mean with the Queen?" Blackwood nodded grimly. "Yesterday, she countermanded the king's orders regarding the military exercises near the border. She said they were too provocative and might upset our neighbors. The generals are confused and frustrated." Alexander felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. His stepmother had always been involved in palace life, but this level of interference in matters of state was unprecedented. Isabella had married his father 5 years ago, shortly after his mother's death from a long illness. At first, Alexander had been grateful that his grieving father had found companionship. Isabella had seemed kind and supportive, helping Edward through his darkest period. But over the past year, her influence had grown exponentially. She had begun attending meetings she had no business being in, offering opinions on matters far outside her expertise, and somehow his father had started deferring to her judgment more and more frequently. "There's something else, Your Highness," Blackwood continued. "The Queen has been meeting privately with several key ministers. Minister Harrison from the Treasury, General Morrison from Defense, even Archbishop Carrington. She's been, how shall I put this, explaining the King's new priorities to them." "New priorities that she's determined?" "It would appear so, yes." Alexander stared out the window at the palace gardens where he and his father used to walk together, discussing affairs of state and the future of the kingdom. Those conversations had become increasingly rare as Isabella inserted herself into every aspect of Edward's daily routine. That evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in the smaller dining room, a tradition that Edward had maintained despite his busy schedule. The conversation was polite but strained, with Isabella dominating most topics. "Edward, I've been thinking about Prince Alexander's upcoming diplomatic mission to the Eastern Kingdoms," Isabella said as she delicately cut her roasted pheasant. Alexander looked up sharply. "What about it?" "Perhaps it would be better to send someone else. Lord Pemberton has more experience with Eastern customs and traditions." "But Alexander has been preparing for this mission for months," Edward said hesitantly. "He speaks their language fluently and has studied their culture extensively." Isabella's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew cold. "Of course, darling, but we must consider what's best for the kingdom. This particular negotiation requires someone with a more delicate touch." Alexander felt his jaw clench. The Eastern Kingdom mission was crucial for establishing new trade routes and strengthening diplomatic ties. He had been looking forward to it as an opportunity to prove his capabilities and contribute meaningfully to the kingdom's future. "Father," Alexander said carefully, "I believe I'm well prepared for this mission. I've spent considerable time studying their economic needs and political structure." Isabella's laugh was light and musical, but somehow condescending. "Oh, Alexander, your enthusiasm is admirable, but sometimes experience trumps preparation." The dismissive tone in her voice ignited something dangerous in Alexander's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Not here, not in front of his father, who was already looking increasingly uncomfortable with the tension at the table. After dinner, Alexander waited in his chambers, pacing back and forth across the Persian carpet his mother had chosen years ago. The familiar pattern usually brought him comfort, but tonight it only reminded him of how much had changed since Isabella's arrival. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called. To his surprise, his father stepped into the room, looking older and more tired than Alexander had seen him in years. "Son, I wanted to talk to you about the Eastern Kingdom mission." Alexander's heart sank. He could already see in his father's eyes that the decision had been made. "Isabella makes some valid points about the delicacy of the situation," Edward continued, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Perhaps this time it would be better to send Lord Pemberton." "Father, with all due respect, this is my area of expertise. I've been training for missions like this my entire life." Edward's shoulders sagged slightly. "I know, Alexander, but Isabella has a way of seeing things that sometimes escapes us. She has insights that, well, she's helped me avoid several potential mistakes recently." Alexander stared at his father, trying to reconcile this uncertain man with the strong, decisive king who had raised him. "What kind of mistakes?" "Oh, various things. Political missteps, economic decisions that could have backfired. She has excellent instincts about these matters." "Since when?" The words slipped out before Alexander could stop them. Edward's expression hardened slightly. "Isabella is my wife and your queen. She deserves respect." "Of course, father. I meant no disrespect. I'm simply concerned about the kingdom's interests." "As am I, son. As am I." But as Edward left the room, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his father's concerns were no longer his own, but rather reflections of Isabella's will. The strong, independent monarch, who had guided Aldermere through wars and economic crises, was slowly being replaced by someone who seemed to need permission for every decision. That night, Alexander stood at his window, looking out over the kingdom that would one day be his to rule. In the distance, he could see lights in the villages, people living their lives and trusting that their royal family would protect and guide them wisely. But how could he fulfill that trust if the current king was no longer truly ruling? And more disturbingly, what would happen to the kingdom if Isabella's influence continued to grow unchecked? The questions haunted him as he finally retired to bed, unaware that in the Queen's chambers, Isabella was already planning her next move in a game whose stakes were higher than anyone yet realized. 3 weeks had passed since the Eastern Kingdom mission had been given to Lord Pemberton, and the results were already becoming apparent. Reports arrived daily of stalled negotiations and cultural misunderstandings that Alexander could have easily avoided. But whenever he tried to discuss the situation with his father, Isabella was inevitably present, steering the conversation away from any criticism of their chosen representative. "Lord Pemberton is doing his best under difficult circumstances," she would say, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes warning against further discussion. Alexander found himself spending more time in the palace archives, studying the histories of previous reigns and looking for guidance from the past. It was there, among dusty volumes and ancient chronicles, that he began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Princess Catherine, the royal librarian and Alexander's childhood friend, noticed his frequent visits to the restricted sections containing sensitive royal documents. "You've been here every day this week," she observed, approaching his table with concern in her eyes. "What are you researching so intensively?" Alexander looked up from a leather-bound volume detailing the reign of King Marcus III, whose kingdom had fallen to internal corruption 3 centuries earlier. "I'm trying to understand something, Catherine. Have you ever heard of cases where a royal consort gradually took control of state affairs?" Catherine's expression grew serious. She had grown up in the palace and understood political undercurrents better than most. "You're talking about puppet monarchs and shadow rulers. It's not common, but history records several instances." "What were the signs?" "Isolation of the monarch from traditional advisors, replacement of key personnel with people loyal to the consort, gradual assumption of decision-making authority." Catherine paused, studying Alexander's face. "You're not just asking for academic interest, are you?" Before Alexander could answer, the library doors opened and Isabella entered, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere, her silk dress rustling softly as she approached their table. "Alexander, darling, I've been looking for you," she said, her smile bright but her eyes taking note of the book spread across the table. "Your father needs to speak with you about the upcoming state dinner preparations." "I'll be there shortly," Alexander replied, not moving to close the books. Isabella's gaze lingered on the historical volumes. "Fascinating reading material, though I do hope you're not dwelling too much on the past when there's so much present work to be done." The subtle threat in her voice was unmistakable to both Alexander and Catherine, though her expression remained perfectly pleasant. After Isabella left, Catherine leaned closer to Alexander and whispered, "Be very careful. If she suspects what you're researching, it could make things much worse for your father." That afternoon's meeting with King Edward revealed just how much worse things had already become. Alexander found his father in the throne room, but he wasn't alone. Isabella sat in a chair that had been positioned directly beside the throne, close enough to whisper in Edward's ear without others hearing. "Ah, Alexander," Edward said, his voice lacking its former warmth. "We need to discuss your recent behavior." "My behavior, father?" Isabella leaned forward slightly. "It's come to our attention that you've been questioning several recent decisions. Some of the ministers have expressed concern about your lack of support for the Crown's new directions." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. The ministers Isabella had been meeting with privately were now reporting his conversations back to her. "I've simply been offering my perspective on matters that affect the kingdom's future." perspective that contradicts official royal policy, Isabella said smoothly. It creates confusion among the staff and undermines the authority of the crown. Edward nodded slowly, as if the words were his own thoughts rather than Isabella's coaching. A united front is essential for effective governance, son. We cannot have the heir apparent publicly questioning the king's decisions. But, father, some of these decisions go against everything you taught me about ruling. The trade agreements you canceled were beneficial to our people. The military reorganization you approved weakens our border defenses. Isabella's eyes flashed dangerously, but her voice remained calm. Perhaps Prince Alexander would benefit from some time away from court. A retreat where he could reflect on his duties and responsibilities. The suggestion hit Alexander like a physical blow. Exile, disguised as a retreat. The classic move to remove a troublesome rival from the political sphere. I don't think that's necessary, Edward said hesitantly, but Alexander could see the doubt in his father's eyes. Of course not permanently, Isabella continued. Just a few months at the mountain estate. It would give him time to study and prepare for his future role without the distractions of daily court politics. That evening, Alexander sought out Lord Chamberlain Blackwood in his private chambers. The older man looked haggard, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. Lord Blackwood, I need to ask you something, and I need your complete honesty. Blackwood glanced around nervously before nodding. Of course, Your Highness. How many of Father's original advisors are still in their positions? The question seemed to age Blackwood even further. Fewer than half, Your Highness. Many have been reassigned to lesser roles or encouraged to retire early. Replaced by whom? People Queen Isabella recommended. They're competent enough, but their loyalty is divided. Alexander understood. Isabella hadn't replaced good advisors with bad ones, which would have been obvious. Instead, she had gradually filled positions with people who owed their advancement to her rather than to King Edward or the kingdom's traditional power structure. There's something else, Blackwood continued reluctantly. The Queen has been reviewing all correspondence before it reaches the king. Letters from foreign dignitaries, reports from provincial governors, even communications from your own staff. She claims it's to help manage His Majesty's workload. She's controlling the flow of information to him. It appears so, yes. The full scope of Isabella's strategy was becoming clear. She hadn't seized power through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual control of the systems that supported royal authority. By managing information, personnel, and access to the king, she had effectively become the real power behind the throne, without anyone being able to point to a specific moment when the transfer had occurred. 2 days later, Alexander was walking through the palace gardens when he overheard a conversation that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden behind a hedge maze, he heard Isabella speaking with Minister Harrison, her voice much sharper than her usual public tone. The prince is becoming a problem, she was saying. His questions are making some of the newer appointees nervous. What do you suggest, Your Majesty? The mountain retreat idea is still on the table. A few months away from court would give us time to solidify the new arrangements. By the time he returns, the changes will be so established that reversing them would seem impossible. And if he refuses to go? Isabella's laugh was cold and calculating. Then we'll need to find another solution. The king's health has been fragile lately. It would be natural for him to rely more heavily on family members he trusts completely. Alexander felt his blood run cold. Isabella wasn't just planning to sideline him. She was preparing to use his father's eventual physical decline to justify her complete control over the kingdom. What about when Prince Alexander eventually becomes king? By then, the systems we're establishing will be so ingrained in the government that any new monarch would have no choice but to work within them. Besides, kings can have accidents, can't they? Especially ones who make rash decisions. The implied threat was unmistakable. Alexander backed away from the hedge as quietly as possible, his mind racing with the implications of what he had heard. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't save his father through gentle persuasion or subtle resistance. Isabella's control was too complete, her strategy too sophisticated. The time for diplomatic solutions had passed. He began reaching out to the few remaining loyal advisors, the displaced ministers, and the military commanders who had served faithfully under Edward's reign. If Isabella wanted to play a game of power, Alexander would ensure that when the final moves were made, he wouldn't be unprepared. But he knew that confronting Isabella directly would require perfect timing and overwhelming evidence. One mistake would give her the excuse she needed to eliminate him entirely from the succession, and the kingdom would fall completely under her shadow rule. The stakes had never been higher, and Alexander realized that he was running out of time. His father grew more dependent on Isabella each day, and with that dependence, the kingdom slipped further from the principles and values that had guided it for generations. Soon, he would have to make a choice, accept defeat and watch his birthright and his people's future disappear, or risk everything in a confrontation that would determine the fate of the crown itself. The morning that changed everything began like any other in Ravenshollow Palace, but Alexander had spent the entire night preparing for what he knew would be the most important day of his life. For weeks, he had been gathering evidence, building alliances, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. That moment arrived when he learned that Isabella had scheduled a private meeting with the royal council to discuss concerns about the prince's stability and fitness for succession. Alexander's network of loyal servants had brought him word at dawn. Isabella planned to present a case for his removal from the line of succession, claiming that his recent behavior showed signs of mental instability and poor judgment. She had already planted seeds of doubt about his temperament with several council members, and today she intended to harvest those doubts into a formal recommendation. But Alexander had his own surprise prepared. The royal council chamber was an imposing room with ancient oak paneling and portraits of former kings watching from gold frames. When Alexander arrived, he found Isabella already seated at the head of the massive table, with King Edward to her right, looking confused and uncomfortable. The 12 council members sat in their traditional positions, but Alexander noticed that 4 of them were Isabella's recent appointees. "Alexander," Isabella said with false warmth, "how good of you to join us. We were just discussing some concerns about your recent conduct." "Were you?" Alexander's voice was controlled, but those who knew him well could hear the dangerous edge beneath the surface. "How thoughtful of you to discuss my conduct without me present." Minister Harrison, one of Isabella's allies, cleared his throat. "Your Highness, there have been reports of erratic behavior, questioning of royal policy, and concerning research into historical precedents for—" "For what, Minister Harrison?" Alexander's eyes were steel. "Please, finish your thought." Isabella intervened smoothly. "What Minister Harrison is trying to say is that your recent actions have raised questions about your readiness to serve the crown effectively." King Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Alexander, son, perhaps you could explain some of your recent interests." The moment had arrived. Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "Certainly, Father. But first, I think the council should be made aware of some interesting facts I've uncovered." Isabella's composure slipped slightly, but she maintained her smile. "I'm sure whatever you've found is fascinating, but perhaps this isn't the appropriate time for historical research presentations." "Oh, but it is extremely appropriate," Alexander said, his voice rising slightly, "especially since we're discussing fitness for the crown." He opened the folder and pulled out the first document. "This is a record of every major policy decision made in the last 18 months. Notice anything interesting about the timeline?" He spread the papers across the table where everyone could see them. Every single reversal of long-standing kingdom policy, Every dismissal of experienced advisors, every cancellation of beneficial trade agreements, every questionable military decision, they all coincide perfectly with private meetings between Queen Isabella and the relevant ministers. Isabella's eyes flashed dangerously. I fail to see what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger. I'm stating facts. You have systematically dismantled 20 years of successful governance and replaced it with a shadow system where you make the decisions and my father rubber stamps them. Alexander! King Edward's voice carried a warning, but it lacked its former authority. No, father. It's time for truth. Alexander pulled out more documents. Here are transcripts of conversations between Queen Isabella and various ministers, discussing managing the king's decision-making process and protecting him from unnecessary stress by filtering all information through her first. Gasps echoed around the table as council members recognized their own quoted words. Isabella had been so confident in her control that she hadn't considered that anyone would dare to document her activities. This is preposterous, Isabella said, but her voice had lost its musical quality and taken on a sharp edge. These could be forgeries, taken out of context. Could they? Alexander's restraint was finally beginning to crack. Then perhaps you can explain this recording? He placed a small device on the table and pressed a button. Isabella's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The prince is becoming a problem. His questions are making some of the newer appointees nervous. By the time he returns, the changes will be so established that reversing them would seem impossible. Besides, kings can have accidents, can't they? Especially ones who make rash decisions. The silence that followed was deafening. King Edward stared at his wife with an expression Alexander had never seen before, a mixture of betrayal, confusion, and dawning understanding. Isabella's mask finally slipped completely. "You were spying on me," she hissed, her refined accent disappearing to reveal something harder and more calculating underneath. "I was protecting my kingdom!" Alexander's voice exploded through the chamber with such force that several council members flinched. "I was watching a manipulative schemer systematically destroy everything my family has built for centuries." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "For months, I've watched you poison my father's mind, turn him against his own judgment, and replace loyal servants with your puppets. I've watched you cancel treaties that would have brought prosperity to our people. I've watched you weaken our defenses and isolate us from our allies." Isabella rose to meet his fury, her own anger finally breaking free. "Your father was weak and indecisive. This kingdom needed strong leadership. My father was a great king before you started whispering poison in his ear." Alexander's roar echoed off the chamber walls, his composure completely shattered now. "He ruled wisely and justly for 2 decades before you decided to turn him into your puppet." King Edward stood up slowly, his face pale, but his eyes clearer than they had been in months. "Isabella," he said quietly, "is this true? Have you been managing my decisions?" Isabella's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on defiance. "I was protecting you, Edward. You were making mistakes, trusting the wrong people, being too soft on enemies and too harsh on friends. I simply helped guide you toward better choices." "Better for whom?" Alexander demanded, still trembling with rage. "Better for you and your ambitions?" "Because they certainly weren't better for the kingdom. I've given this kingdom stability and direction it hadn't seen in years. You've given it chaos and weakness." Alexander slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "You've isolated us diplomatically, weakened us militarily, and created a government where loyalty is bought rather than earned." Isabella's voice turned venomous. "And what would you have done? You're nothing but a spoiled prince who's never had to make a real decision in his life. At least I understand what it takes to hold power." "Power?" Alexander's laugh was harsh and bitter. You think this is about power? This is about duty, about serving something greater than yourself. Something you've never understood because you're nothing but a common social climber who married her way into a position she never deserved. The insult hit home. Isabella's face contorted with rage. How dare you speak to me that way? I am your queen. You are not my queen. Alexander's voice shook the very foundations of the room. You are a scheming interloper who has betrayed the trust of everyone in this kingdom. My mother was a queen. She served her people with grace and wisdom. You are nothing but a parasite feeding off the power and respect that others built. King Edward stepped between them, his own voice finally carrying the authority it had lacked for months. Enough! The single word cut through the chaos like a blade. Alexander and Isabella both turned to look at him, and for the first time in over a year, Edward looked like the king he had always been. Isabella, he said, his voice heavy with sadness and disappointment. I need to know the truth. All of it. Have you been manipulating my decisions? Have you been meeting secretly with my ministers? Have you been planning to remove Alexander from the succession? Isabella's defiance crumbled as she saw the clarity returning to Edward's eyes. Her carefully constructed persona fell away completely, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath. Everything I did was for us, Edward, for our future together. Alexander would have ruined everything we built. What we built. Edward's voice grew stronger with each word. Or what you built using my name and authority. The recording device still sat on the table between them, a small reminder of the threats Isabella had made against both father and son. King Edward looked around the room at his council members, some loyal, some compromised, all watching this moment that would define the future of their kingdom. By royal decree, Edward announced, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, Queen Isabella is hereby stripped of all titles and privileges. She will be escorted from the palace immediately and is forbidden from returning to the capital. Isabella's face went white. Edward, you can't mean this. I'm your wife. You are someone who threatened my son and manipulated my crown for your own purposes. The marriage is dissolved as of this moment. Alexander felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion wash over him. The confrontation he had dreaded and prepared for was over, but the damage would take years to repair. In the days that followed, the kingdom began the long process of healing. Ministers who had been dismissed were recalled, policies that had been changed were reviewed, and slowly the government that had served Aldemir faithfully for decades was restored. King Edward, freed from Isabella's influence, returned to the decisive and wise ruler he had always been. But the experience had aged him, and he began preparing Alexander more seriously for the day when the crown would pass to the next generation. Alexander never forgot the lesson of those dark months. How quickly a kingdom could be brought to the brink of ruin by someone who understood how to manipulate trust and exploit weakness. When his time came to rule, he would remember that vigilance was the price of freedom, and that power belonged not to those who grasped for it, but to those who served something greater than themselves. The palace halls that had once echoed with whispered conspiracies now rang with honest debate and genuine counsel. The kingdom of Aldemir had survived its greatest internal threat, not through warfare or revolution, but through the courage of a prince who refused to let ambition triumph over duty, and a king who found the strength to choose truth over comfort. Isabella disappeared from the capital that very day, her dreams of power and control nothing but memories. The kingdom she had tried to claim belonged once again to those who truly understood what it meant to serve their people rather than themselves.